Everything you can imagine to pursue is interesting if you just dig hard enough. If you strive to become better, smarter, wiser, you should love to be wrong. And that to me is what's so exciting about being alive. I'm making Ruby on Rails for me. The fact that there are other people who enjoy using it too does bring me satisfaction, but it's not the primary one. Why aren't we all doing that? Why aren't we all trying to optimize our life in such a way that much of it is enjoyable? So enjoyable that you would qualify it as a flow state. And I think the modern way of working is almost optimized to prevent it. So many people today are focused on just adding more and more hours. They're not thinking about how those hours are spent. The wonderful thing about part-time management is it is a completely scalable resource. For me personally, you are never, ever getting me back into an office.
I was telling Alex, like he was, asking me like, who's coming in, and I tell him, and he's like, well, what's he all about? And I'm like, he started Ruby on Rails, and now he's on the board of Shopify. He's written 4 books, like one of the OGs of software as a CEO. And I'm like, and he also has raced. How do you pronounce it? Le Mans. Yeah.
Yep,
Okay.
Yep.
And I'm like, yeah, and he's like raced, and I think even like won or gone in second, and then he's like, he raced in Le Mans. Like of all your accomplishments.
People care about that thing is something that really registers.
Of all of your accomplishments, that's the thing that got. And I was like, really? That was kind of like lower on my list. But of all the things, that was the thing that got his blood pumping.
It's one of those like famous amongst few. Like if you know what Le Mans is and sports car driving in general, that certainly ranks up there. But most people don't.
You driving from LA here. Is actually because you enjoy being in cars, which is also why you do Le Mans.
I'm part of it. I mean, I do like cars. This, I'd say it's not like, it's a lot of spirited driving on the, the 405 or whatever.
Yeah, right.
I just took the straight route up.
Right.
It's also just, I like being in the car. I think it's just such a calming environment. I think it's a great place to think. And I think it's also a great place to have undivided attention to something like podcasts or any other medium that you're listening to.
Yeah.
Because you have that notion. It's funny. I've actually noticed the same thing on TikTok. A lot of videos that are mainly about delivering an audio content have to have some visual element that stimulates the brain. So you'll see a lot of these short videos, they'll have some guy jumping around in Minecraft while there's this inspirational,
or it's like Mario Kart going on, or something.
Mario Kart, something else like that. So I think they've actually figured out that some degree of split attention somehow works. That is a good way of getting the brain to absorb the material in a way. And I find being in the car is a good. I think it's the same way, actually, a lot of people talk about taking a shower and getting a good idea. That you have this, default mode behavior that you're doing. You're taking a shower. That requires a minimal amount of activity. And then while that's going on, your brain is susceptible to new ideas in a new way. And I find the same thing to be true about driving.
It's almost like so I totally agree. It's almost like in my experience, like a cognitive dissonance from your monkey brain, where it's like, we believe as humans that we can control all of our thoughts, and therefore our thoughts must be productive, and therefore productive thoughts must mean some good outcome. Absolutely. But in many ways, we're all looking for some version of a reprieve from that. And I think in many ways, when we have the opportunity to focus away from those thoughts, it allows the other things to happen. For me, it's when I'm working out, I'm on a bike ride. That's when it happens for me.
Yes.
Sounds like it happens for you driving.
It does. And actually, that connects to the point about why I love race cars so much. Because it's that times 10,000.
Can you say, what is Le Mans?
So, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is one of the longest running and certainly the most prestigious endurance sports car race in the world. It's been going for over 100 years in Le Mans, France, where they started a race back in, 1924, something like that, to prove that cars were reliable and that they could go that far for that long. And then they just kept doing it. They took a few years break over World War II. But other than that, it's basically been going ever since. And today it remains this pinnacle of sports car racing. It's mixed class racing, so you have faster cars together with slower cars, and you have a lot of cars, unlike something like Formula One, where they're all similar cars. I mean, there are better cars or worse cars, but they look quite similar.
Yeah.
And there's only 2 of them. At Le Mans, we race 65, and instead of racing for 2 hours, we race for 24 hours.
Straight.
You have 3 drivers, so you're alternating between the drivers. But every driver might end up being in the car for 2, 3, or even 4 hours at a time. And then you get a little bit of time off, then catch a short break, and then it's back in the car. And it's just an incredible...
How fast are you going?
So what's so funny about that is it's not really the speed, the top speed, that gives the sensation that this is fast or this is wild. It's actually the G-forces you pull. It's when you turn, it's when you brake, that's when it feels quick. But we go over 200 miles an hour.
It's pretty fast.
It's funny because it sounds like that's the top line figure and that's what feels fast. It doesn't feel fast at all.
Yeah.
Going 200 miles an hour or 210 miles an hour or 190, that difference doesn't really matter. But the difference between pulling, say, 2.5 Gs or 3.2 Gs in a turn is night and day.
Yeah. The reason I ask how fast you're going is if you're driving 200 plus miles an hour, is it a circular track?
It is a circular track.
Okay.
It's a circular track in the sense that it goes around, but there are twists and turns. It's not like NASCAR.
It's not like a NASCAR, right? Okay.
It's actually, it's quite a long circuit, and part of the circuit is public road. That's part of why Le Mans
is so it's more like F1 than it is NASCAR.
It's absolutely like F1 in the design of the track, except for the fact that we also race partly on public roads in France.
And how long are the F1 races?
They're just about 2 hours.
So I guess this is maybe the question behind the question behind the question is, if Lewis Hamilton is racing for 2.5 hours at a time, and all he does is race, and all he's doing is training his body. Like I've seen the neck exercises that these guys do. That's all for basically combating the G-force.
That's right.
Right? And
that's right.
So, and you're like, your full-time job is running companies, right? And you're coming off the couch. Like, how are you?
You're not coming off the couch.
You're not.
If you come off the couch, you really have no business being at Le Mans because you won't make it.
Yeah.
I do have to train. I don't train like a Lewis Hamilton. First of all, I'm not trying to be the best in the world. Second of all, in a Formula One car, you'll pull 4.5 Gs.
Yeah.
And as I just said, that difference between 2.5 and 3.2 is quite large.
Right.
The difference between 3.2 and 4.5
it's exponential.
is huge too. Exactly. So they do have to be at a different physical shape. I think Formula One drivers are some of the most well-trained athletes in the world, exactly because of that, and exactly because the margins are so small.
Yeah.
You'll watch them race for 2 hours, and the race will finish 2 seconds apart.
Yeah.
And those 2 seconds are added up by 1/10 of a second a lap sometimes.
Yeah.
So the degree of consistency that they need at that level, the pinnacle of the sport, is off the scale. And it's not quite the same in sports car racing, which is why I enjoy sports car racing, because it does not demand for me to be within 1/10 of a second to be in a competitive car. And that's where it also differs. Where Formula One is for literally the best drivers in the world, sports car racing has a long history of allowing amateurs to be part of the game. And that's why I'm at Le Mans. You don't get to be a fan of basketball and decide, hey, you know what? Can I get in on the NBA finals?
Right.
Like, is there room for me on the team here? That doesn't happen. In sports car racing, it does. The entire industry is partly built up around the fact that enthusiast amateurs will show up and help fund the operation. Because that's, of course, the other side of it. It is tremendously expensive to run a car for 24 hours. It is literally $1 million.
Do you pay for it?
I pay part of it. That has been my equation for the 15 years I've been racing, is that I have to show up, and the reason, as I say, I get to be part of the NBA finals of this is that I help fund it. If I didn't help fund it, there'd be kids who've been go-karting since they were 4 years old who will absolutely be faster than I am in the car. So that's my entry ticket, which is why I do it gladly. I love the fact that this requires a substantial amount of capital to mount a campaign like that. And therefore, there's room for someone like me who might not fund the whole thing.
Yeah.
But I have some pace, I have some talent.
Yeah.
So you find the equation where your amount of budget meets your amount of talent and a team that needs exactly those two components.
Yeah. And how many G's are you pulling, pardon my ignorance here, but like for a Tesla when you accelerate and you get that feeling where it snaps you back?
I think it's just 1.2, 1.3 or something,
Okay.
which is actually a fair amount. And it is
feel
enough that if you're not prepared for it, you will snap your neck.
Yeah.
That's why you lean back in a Model S Plaid when you floor it. But it's not the same as pulling the G's in a corner, because the G's in a corner are sustained for much longer. And it's funny because I've taken people out in race cars, and sometimes all it takes is 3 laps for a normal human's neck to literally give up, and they can no longer hold their head up. They must just let their helmet sort of flap from side to side or lean it on the railing of the car, because they aren't muscles that most people use to that degree.
Totally.
I mean, 2G, you're just pulling kilos and kilos on your head in a way that you don't need in daily life.
Totally.
So you do actually have to practice it particularly for that. And I do it the same thing. When I practice, we have these bands, these big rubber bands. I pull my head.
Yeah.
Not quite the contraptions that they use in F1 where they have the whole helmets and masks and this, that, and the other thing. But it's the same principle.
And going back to my original question of when you're like while you drove up here, when you're doing a 2 to 3 hour shift, is the world around you completely still?
I'd say the world around me is completely imminent. That is the only thing you focus on, and that's the magic.
And your mind is still?
My mind is still, in the sense that it is the ultimate expression of flow. So it's actually the same reason why I love programming so much, or like writing, that you can get into this state of mind where you're completely engrossed in the activity and no other concern is floating around bothering you. When you're in that car and a turn is coming up and you're about to hit exactly 2.5 Gs, not 2.2, then you're going way too slow. Not 2.7, then you're going too fast and you're going to end up in the wall. 2.5 exactly, because that is the mathematical equation for what those tires can hold for the car at that level of acceleration. You don't think about anything else. And that is sort of a Zen Buddhist kind of state of mind. I'm not great at meditation, but I have in my mind that is what someone who's really good at meditation can do. They can focus on the moment, on the breath, on every other aspect except for the rummaging inside their head on demand. I can't do it on demand. Either I sit down in front of a computer and I hold my hands together and I pray it happens when I'm trying to program, because that's amazing and I'm incredibly productive when it happens. Or I literally, it's turnkey in the race car. It's on demand. You close that door. You go out on track. You're going that fast. Either you're in a state of flow or you're probably going to crash. And if you crash, at minimum, it's going to be expensive. It might well hurt, or ultimately can be a lot worse. That level of criticality has such an amazing ability to focus the mind, literally put on the caps like a horse has, and you can only see the moment in front of you, and it's an incredible feeling.
I think to your point on meditation, I think that's why most people can't do meditation. And it's also the same reason why you have audio on YouTube with random Mario Kart people on the video, is because it is a way to, whether it's distracting or focusing the mind, it's doing something to let you focus. You know?
And I think that's why I got so addicted to the race car stuff.
You think you're addicted to it?
I'm addicted to the state of flow, and race cars is the most consistent way I've found to access that world. It's more or less like a portal. And before I was race car driving, I was programming, I'm still into programming, I'm into writing, I'm still into writing. And I love those moments where you just lose track of time and place. Where you sit down in front of the computer, I'm working on a hard problem, you think 20 minutes have passed by and it's actually been an hour and a half. You're not thinking about, I need to pay these bills, or I need to be there tomorrow. It's just this immensely gratifying mind space to be in. Which I think is why, I'm going to butcher his name, Mikhail Memensky, something, wrote this book called essentially Flow, which was out of a study of human happiness. And first he was interested in just human happiness in general. And then he realized that whenever he was getting the anecdotes from people about when did you experience peak bliss, peak happiness, it was all these moments of flow. It was when someone was engrossed in an activity where they lost track of time and space and didn't think about anything else, was just totally in the moment, usually pursuing an activity that was just beyond their grasp. It wasn't routine. It wasn't trivial. It was a difficult problem, but one they could reach for if they stretched. And I think you see this in many disciplines, especially in sports, where you're constantly trying to push yourself just beyond what you can do right now, competing against a better competitor, rock climbing a steeper cliff, something else that gives you that complete immersion. It's just an incredible feeling. And to me, it is the best drug I've ever had the experience of being part of. And I think when you experience that, and I don't know if everyone has, but if you do, it is addictive in the sense that you want more.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? Sometimes I feel, so I get this at different times. I actually do get it almost, I almost find it the most when I'm doing these types of conversations on the podcast. And sometimes I feel guilty in when I evaluate my flow state, because what's really happening is I'm now out of flow state and I'm spending most of my days out of flow state. And that's a shitty reality. Whereas I'll give you another example. My girlfriend is generally kind of at peace. Like, I can just tell that her monkey brain doesn't go crazy like mine. So she doesn't need this version of flow or almost like escapism to get away from the cognitive overload of whatever is happening in my brain. Do you ever experience that? Like, I don't know if guilt is the right word.
I don't think guilt is what I experience, but I totally recognize the feeling. And many people have. Steve McQueen, who is a famous actor and race car driver, who also went to Le Mans. He finished second in, I think, 67 or something. There's a whole movie made about his experience. Had this great quote that illustrates this point exactly. Racing is life, everything else is just waiting. Actually, that's not exactly the quote, but that's the effect of the quote.
Yeah.
And it's exactly that. When you've experienced a flow state like that, it is such a dopamine high that normal reality can feel like a crash. And I actually think, to some degree, there's a connection here between the modern day obsession, if you will, with ADHD and diagnoses in general, where there's some degree of that you've been exposed to a peak dopamine experience. And now suddenly the mundane email job that you have feels a little boring. I'm not sure that's a pathology. I actually think that's a natural human drive that we have. That if we have had a taste of how exciting life can be, we're not willing to settle for the bullshit that usually constitutes much of modern life. I certainly see that in myself and my normal work as well. I've had incredible highs in programming and writing and running a company and dealing with everything that's involved with that experience. That when days are a little boring, which many of them are, I'm not hugely motivated. I don't think, again, that that's a pathology. In fact, if anything, it's a carrot to find out, okay, what is the next thing that's extra exciting, that's going to tickle me in this way, that's going to give me the path to the flow state. I actually have to come up with something novel. I have to come up with something that's interesting, not just to other people, but to myself most of all. If that's not a driver for innovation, if that's not a driver for progress or even courage, I don't know what is.
But what's interesting, that what fascinates me about you is that, let's take the 3 buckets of flow state that we just described you have. One is racing, the other is coding, and the third is writing. Okay? You have almost organized everything in your life around those flow states.
That's exactly right. And
like, you've taken it all the way to the extreme.
it's funny because it doesn't feel very extreme. It feels, why aren't we all doing that? Why aren't we all trying to optimize our life in such a way that much of it is enjoyable? So enjoyable that you would qualify it as a flow state. That should be actually what a lot of us are trying to optimize for. And I don't think it has to be exotic. It does not have to be race car driving. I agree. That is a very privileged pursuit that requires all sorts of things. People find that flow state playing the guitar.
Yeah.
They find that flow state going rollerblading.
Yeah.
They find that flow state working out. Some very accessible activities give you that access if you pursue them with the intent of competence. If you're actually trying to get better, if you're actually trying to reach. And then I also think at work, the best work usually happens there. In fact, I would go so far as to say there's, across my entire career, there's the work I've done in my flow states, and then everything else basically doesn't matter. Like everything else is so down the totem pole of value in terms of what I've created, put into the world, launched, been a part of, that 90% at least of the value comes from those flow state moments. And I think the modern way of working is almost optimized to prevent it. If you just look at most people's weekly calendar, it is like it was designed by someone who knew everything about flow states to prevent those from happening. Oh, here's a meeting at not 9 o'clock when you arrive. I'll give you 45 minutes where your brain can just waste its cycles going over email or stupid shit online. Because it knows that you can't actually enter the flow state in 45 minutes and get anything productive out of it. It usually takes 20 to 30 minutes to get into the flow state. You're not going to do that if you have something in 45 minutes. And then you also know, oh, you have another thing at 11:45. Oh, that's just 2 hours. I don't know, is that worth it? And then you have another thing at 2. Now that's an entire day that only perhaps have 3 activities on your calendar. Each of them may be relatively short. They may just be half an hour things. But that entire day have now been squandered from the perspective of flow. That day is not accessible to a flow state. So many people's calendars look like that every day. Not just every once in a while, but every day. My calendar doesn't look anything like that.
What's your calendar look like?
I was just thinking about last week. I had 3 things on it for the entire week. Meetings, quote unquote. They weren't even real meetings. They were just turn on your camera and be on Zoom. And I had even optimized those such that they would line up with lunch. That I could roll directly from that into lunch such that it would not be 2 interruptions in the day, it would just be 1. And not because I'm trying to hyper-optimize 120-hour work week and it all has to be strategic, including my bathroom breaks and all the other nonsense that sometimes come out of the hyper-productivity focus. I have a deep conviction that 40 hours a week is plenty. That most people would be so lucky if they got 4, 5 hours of great uninterrupted time in a single day to really do work. We could move mountains in that amount of time. But so many people today are focused on just adding more and more hours. They're not thinking about how those hours are spent. They're not thinking about the calendar Tetris that's being played with all the little blocks, meeting here, meeting there, preventing them from getting into the flow state, and therefore preventing them from cracking the hard problems, from making the big leaps, from doing the work that's not just personally satisfying to do, not just the kind of stuff that makes it worth getting up in the morning, but also the kind of stuff that produces all the value. Also, all the stuff that makes the company valuable, the product valuable, your connection to customers more valuable. All of the value happens usually by people who are left alone for long enough to have a continuous thought about something difficult. And we have designed so much of modern office email jobs to prevent that. It's not just a calendar. In a lot of places, and I thought for a hot second that perhaps it had tipped and we were done with this, the modern open office is literally the worst environment known to humans for getting access to the flow state. The interruptions in terms of noise and visual that you get sitting in an open office is, again, as designed by some Dr. Evil trying to prevent people from getting access to that flow state. And then the creative, often halfway miserable people who have to work in that environment try to come up with all these noise canceling headphones or shielding themselves for it. And we somehow think this is the state of the art. This is as good as it's going to be. This is the final design of a great office, is a bunch of computers right next to each other. This is where creativity is going to happen. Absolutely nonsense. And that notion of creativity happening in that space, I find so hilarious because it's usually always imposed by people who don't actually have to do the work, who've retired from doing the work and are now doing management by working around, management by checking in, management by being there, and are on a different schedule. They no longer need perhaps 3, 4, 5 hours of uninterrupted time. They're fine with 15 minutes here and an hour there because that's what their world is already. They just miss the fact that that doesn't work for people who actually have to do stuff. And this is why, at least at 37 Signals, we have really embraced the idea that no one should have that role full-time. No one should be a manager full-time.
Nobody.
I'm not a manager full-time. Jason, my business partner, is not a manager full-time. We need connection to the individual contribution. That we have to be subjected to the same working environment that everyone else we ask at the company to work in that environment.
No managers.
No full-time managers. There's still management, but it happens part-time. And the wonderful thing about part-time management is it is a completely scalable resource. If you hire a full-time manager, you will get a chunk of management every week that is 40 hours. Whether this company needs 40 hours of management every week or not, that's the chunk you have. And here's the curse. If a week comes by and you only need 7 hours of management, do you know what you're going to get? You're going to get 33 hours of bullshit infected onto everyone else in the company. That's how management works. If you cannot exhaust the resource will come up with ways to justify itself. And that usually involves pulling others off what they're actually working in into either pointless meetings or excess expeditions, when really they should just have been left to do the job that you asked them to do last week. And you would have gotten so much more done if you just let people do their jobs. That's the problem with full-time management. It comes in one chunk. The kind of part-time management we have enables that. If there's a week where we need 40 hours of management, if there's a week we need 50 hours of management or 60 hours of management, okay, I'll do 60 hours of management. Very rare. A couple of occasions in my career, I can remember needing 60 hours or even just 40 hours of management in a whole week. Most weeks have 10 hours. Some weeks, a beautiful zero. A beautiful zero when you realize that the machine you've set up, this organization of the people that you've hired, you've put it on a task, they don't need you this week. They have their charter, they have their map, they know where they're going. You just need to leave them alone for a hot minute, week, or maybe even 2. The greatest gift you can give, not just your organization and your employees, but even your damn shareholders, is sit on your damn hands. Now, problem is, of course, most people can't do that. I can't even do that, which is why I also have my own work. So if I don't have management to do, I'll sit down and program. If I don't have management to do, I'll sit down and write. I'll sit down and do something else that does not involve me imposing myself on the rest of the company, because that's the greatest gift I can give them. And if you take all of that and you combine it, this idea that most people have a work week and a work calendar that looks like a Tetris game in progress, where all these blocks are falling down and preventing them from having long stretches of uninterrupted time, and you have all these full-time managers who sometimes don't have a full-time job to do, but will invent one, you get the modern enigma of how we can have hundreds of people, thousands of people, doing essentially bullshit jobs in the David Graeber sense of the word. The existential dread that you go to work and you're there from Monday to Friday, and on Friday afternoon, you think, man, wow, that was a busy week. But what did I get done? Oh, I had 3 meetings on Monday, and then we did the thing on Wednesday, and then I didn't do anything. I didn't contribute anything meaningful to this damn world. And if I was not there that week, the world would have been just fine. Maybe it would have been better than fine. I think that is the center of the malaise. And I think what's so wonderful about the current moment that we're in is that there's finally a challenge to that. When Elon walked in with that damn sink and then laid off 80% of Twitter, we got the greatest modern illustration of that sentiment. That the vast majority of people at large companies, especially tech companies, or maybe not even especially tech companies, but also tech companies, they don't contribute that much. Not necessarily through any fault of their own, although I think there's plenty of that to go around as well, but through the institutional environment that they're in. One that squanders their weeks, week in and week out, year in and year out, on pointless meetings, pointless interruptions, and overeager managers who want to feel needed.
And how big is 37 Signals today? How big is the company?
It is smaller than it was 2.5 years ago when we peaked in size. 2 years ago, I think it was, where we were about 80 people. Today, we're just under 50. And that number is essentially a realization of 20 years of trying to find the perfect optima for how to run a company like this. Where you have 0 full-time managers, where you can do it all part-time. I do think there is a tipping point where that no longer works, that you get like a Dunbar number, you break through that, and suddenly things fall apart. And I think we've seen that at scale. If you look at the holacrazy stuff they were doing at Zappos for a moment, where everything was just self-organizing teams. Or you look at some other large tech companies who seems to have a bunch of different fiefdoms and no one setting a vision and being in charge. Plenty of examples of that. It is difficult to do that at scale. I think for us, what we found is at 50 people, it's not that difficult. It's actually a relatively easy problem. And I love easy problems. I love to arrange my life and my work around finding easy, high-value problems. And again, does this mean that everyone could do it? Can you do this at every company? Could Google run entirely without full-time managers? No, probably not. Probably not. Because there is enough managerial work that you will have people literally need 40 hours a week. But then you also have to accept that that is going to have some severe costs. And I think that was part of what Elon showed at Twitter, is that sometimes those costs are so pathological that you can end up with 80% of the company essentially detracting value from the enterprise overall. And I think you'd be quite full of yourself if you work at a large company and you don't think that, I don't know, maybe not 80%, but maybe 50, at least 30% of this enterprise. They're here, but not in a net positive way. And I think for us, and for me, we just thought, you know what? I don't have a need to run the biggest company in the world. I want to optimize my day, exactly as you say, around these buckets of flow. How do I get access to that? How do I get rid of as much bullshit as possible? How do I free up my calendar as much as possible? Because that's the other thing. If you are a CTO or CEO of a company with 500 employees, your calendar is going to be packed. That becomes unavoidable at some point. Very avoidable at 50. Very avoidable. And this is one of the reasons why I've long advocated for the idea that, well, it's great for the economy, for the US, for the world to have some large companies. I think that's wonderful. We need large companies. They can do things at scale in a way that small companies can only dream of. We also need small companies, and we need a lot of them. We need a lot of little 50-person companies who can push things forward in a way because they're not sort of inside of that. I think that's the whole ideal picture of startups. Ideal picture of you can do a different category of problem solving when you don't have to deal with the behemoth of a corporation.
Do you feel like there is a level of selfishness to the way that you have articulated your day?
100%. I have absolutely optimized my working life around the idea that the schedule would permit me to enjoy work for decades. And I think a lot of, especially startups, are optimized about getting a certain end result in 7 to 10 years and struggling through that period and then hoping that the lottery coupon comes up good. And if it does, wonderful. Now you have a big pot of gold and probably also a sense of accomplishment. And in the best case scenarios, you end up with one of those big genre defining companies that really set the tone. Most people do not end up with that experience. That's just math, right? Most startups don't end up doing that. They end up some way through that path and realize, all right, it didn't work. They didn't get the product market fit. They didn't get the scale. They didn't whatever. If you then spend that entire period, which for a lot of people is a substantial portion of their 20s or 30s, and it was one mission, one drive, one focus, you could end up with a lot of regret. Not only could you, many people do. They end up with, again, a sense of existential regret. Not necessarily because their job was a bullshit job. Many of them pursue missions that they're fully engaged in, they believe in, but it does not pan out. And in the process, they've sacrificed the idea of perhaps having a family, perhaps having hobbies, perhaps all of these other aspects of life that I embrace fully. This is part of the selfishness.
Yeah.
I want to work 40 hours or less a week. In the summer, we work 32 hours. We take Fridays off during the entire summer. And I spend some of that time going racing. I spend some of that time reading books. I spend a lot of that time with my kids. I spend it working out. I'm spending it being maybe this is, I don't know, over the top, but whole human.
Yeah.
Not just like this one aspect of it. And I think that level of selfishness is almost like the selfishness of, Adam Smith with the butcher. You don't expect the butcher and the cobbler to produce their goods out of love for you, the stranger. No, out of their own self-interest.
Yeah.
I'm building this kind of company out of my self-interest. And the net effect is that we then build a nice place to work for people, including a nice place to work and make products that customers love and that are different from the kind of stuff you would get out of big tech or whatever. So I think that selfishness is actually a virtue to embrace.
It is. I agree with you. But pushing this like all the way to the logical extreme as you are, don't you think, and maybe I'm just caught in the modern trappings of why people are at companies, but do you ever not think that you lose some community of people that are at 37 Signals to be a part of something that is bigger than them as a whole, right? And maybe I'm romanticizing this, but if you're doing a startup, you're all in the office, you're all doing something that seems really hard, and maybe you're wasting some of that time, and maybe it's not optimized as it should be, but it's not as individualized of an endeavor as what you're describing. And do you think as a result of that, maybe you lose some part of a feeling that you're a part of something bigger? And maybe what you're going to tell me is, I don't care. And the trade-off for that is that if I can have that, or I have the time to go race in France, work out, spend time with my kids and my family, that is what happiness is for me. And that's what I want.
Multiple answers. First, there is a selection process, no doubt about it. The people who come to work at 37 Signals want different things out of work than the people who go at some AR startup where I saw the billboards coming into the city here.
Sure.
They're different people, sometimes at different stages in their life. Sometimes there is a youth component to it, I think, for not bad reasons. In fact, I credit much of my current intuition on how to run a company well on having been part of some of those endeavors early on in my career.
Right.
I got to work at some startups where it was, let's come to the office all the time, let's stay until late into the evening. There was some camaraderie in that. And I think that is highly appealing to people at a certain stage in their life. I also think that there's a huge number of people who either have that somewhere else, that they don't need work to provide their sense of community, their sense of belonging. They get it out of their rowing club, out of their chess club, out of their families, out of their friendship groups, out of all sorts of other aspects of their life. And the pitch, especially in the tech industry, that if you want to go all in, you got to go all in, is pretty exclusive. exclusionary. And I'd actually say that's the extreme part of the equation. The idea that everything has to be in the office. It's got to be bet on the office. This is why we ended up with these campuses that are half adult daycares. Laundry, let's do it here. Dinner, let's do it here. Let's do everything here. And I actually have a theory as to why we ended up with the entire woke DEI epicenter being in the tech industry was because of that. That you have this continuation of campus life, everything is taken care of you. You don't have to live in, quote unquote, the real world. And also, you have to be there 24/7. Therefore, any expression of your personal political engagement or otherwise will be expressed at work to the great detriment of those companies. I think we're perhaps starting to realize that now. But to the direct point of, is it different people? It is. There are different people who have different risk tolerances too, who would rather say, hey, I'll take some stock options here, even if there's only a 1 in 200 chance that that's going to be the next Stripe or Meta or whatever, that they're most likely going to end up with some worthless lottery coupons. And that's fine. They don't necessarily have obligations or otherwise. And then there are people who are more safety orientated, who either perhaps already have a family or just don't have that disposition. And I think we need options for both. I think the worst thing you can do is take someone who needs security, some degree of it, as much as we could ever have in a modern job, and then shove them into a modern space rocket chasing startup that more likely than not will fail, and more likely than not will require a extreme degree of commitment to work that excludes their ability to do all these other things. That doesn't work well, I think, for neither the individual or the company. And same the other way. If you have Schwarzbloggling person who really just wants to be on the action, they don't have a lot of other things going on, great, wonderful. You had sailors who used to jump on these ships and it would be an all-in exercise as they would sail around the world. The modern startup is a little bit like that. And we should have options for both of it. And the same goes for in-office versus remote. For me personally, you are never, ever getting me back into an office. I credit basically all the good things that ever happened in my career with finding the opportunity to work remotely. Everything that I've been able to get good at happened at home. Every opportunity to be in an open office interruption factory perhaps provided other things, but that did not provide the opportunity for me to get good at the things I want to get good at.
But don't you think that in order for you to create this system that you've created, you have had to do it exactly the way that 37 Signals was built? What I mean by that is you have not raised money. Well, I guess Jeff Bezos is your first outside investor, but until him.
Not even an investor. That was secondaries. No, none of the money went into the company. Jeff didn't get any control or rights to tell us what to do or when to do it. So I think just to stop you on that point, that is one of the absolute key pillars of it. By the time you take other people's money, you no longer control your ability to design the organization as you see fit.
Yep.
You will absolutely have to design it in some variation of cornflower blue, some variation of the playbook that already exists and that investors are comfortable with. Now, maybe you'll get some leeway if you're already a proven stock and you can be a little crazy in a few ways, but most people, once they take other people's money, are beholden to that money. And of course it is. That is, in some ways, I can't even quibble with that. I would be the same way to some degree. If I give you some of my money, I want some say on how you're using it, how you're spending it, and hopefully also believe that the way you're doing it is going to lead to the outcomes that I'm looking for. Which is why I've been an advocate of bootstrapping for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
Because that does open up a second door where you do get to design an organization in a different way. And I think it is such a shame that the industry that enabled bootstrapping more than any other industry I can imagine, the tech industry, where all you need is some smart brains for some amount of time using commodity hardware, they can build anything. That was the industry we decided to pour all the venture capital into? That seems to me like a weird misnomer. And it's not even because I have a problem with venture capital. I am hugely grateful for the fact that if you want to send a rocket to Mars, there's some people who will show up and say, yeah, I'll put 100 million into that. I'll put $2 billion into that. Let's send some rockets to Mars. That's where the money should go, on rocket fuel and prototypes and physical things. But it befuddles me, especially when it comes to something as mundane as, say, B2B SaaS. That's where we wanted to spend all the money, when that was the domain that enabled and allowed bootstrapping more than any other domain that I can imagine. I think that's just kind of funny. And I think it's especially funny because software is this amazing business model where there's zero marginal cost, or you can at least construe your business model in such a way that there are zero marginal cost. Now, you can go in other directions. You can go into enterprise sale, and then you can somehow find a way to spend $3 to make one, and all the other nonsense that goes on in the software world. But you don't have to do that. And there are plenty of companies, well, I don't know if there's plenty, but there are companies who have chosen a different way. We're one of them. And I don't think that what we've done is all that special. First of all, the kind of software that we work on is, I think, good. I think we make great software. We'll hold it up against competitors any time of the day. I think Basecamp is one of the best ways to manage your projects. Of course I do. I make Basecamp. But we're not sending rockets to Mars. Like, it's not sort of out of this world weird stuff that we're doing. We're doing something pretty mundane in the grand scheme of things. And we were able to do that and build that up because software allows for 90% margins very easily. And that software allows for 10x productivity. The whole idea of the 10x programmer is not only real, I think it's one of the greatest descriptions of what software is in general. That there is this non-linear relationship between the investment of time and the value of the outcomes. That the greatest software makers can, with a tiny team, create unfathomable value. And that we have not seen more examples of taking that premise and enabling entrepreneurs to build bootstrap businesses on top of that, such that they can build the kind of businesses that they want to build. And the reason I'm so extra furious about this is that the majority of startup founders I've talked to who've been through a venture capital ride, sometimes more than once, almost invariably have the disposition that if they're doing it again, they're not doing that. That the venture capital route perhaps enabled something, and sometimes they got very rich off it. They don't want to do that again that way. So I think there's some natural appeal that still actually puzzles me as to why it hasn't attracted more folks to it. Now, some of it is, okay, you still got to get started, and if you haven't accumulated capital and so forth. But we live in a time where in the US, software developers, if we just take that as an example, salaries are astronomical, never been higher. It's never been more possible to work up a nest egg, to take a shot with your own capital, just off of a few years of working in this industry, yet it's relatively rare.
But why do you think, so maybe let's just take some examples here. Let's take Zapier, or let's take 1Password. They were bootstrapped. And at some point, they took venture capital.
Yes.
Why do you think even the companies that were maybe even arguably more successful at the time when they took venture capital than where you are today, success is defined by, call it revenue and profits, okay? Why did they succumb to the pressure, if it is pressure?
I think it is temptation more than pressure. And I know that temptation because we faced it. In the early days of 37 Signals, back in 2005, before we had a conversation with Jeff Bezos, we had maybe 40, 50 conversations with different VCs. We had a couple of acquisition teams out sniffing. And at that point, we were doing well. We were growing quickly, but we weren't hugely profitable. We weren't throwing off mass sums of money. And when someone shows up in that situation and essentially waves a $20 million check, which is by modern standards perhaps pretty pathetic, but in 2005, it seemed like all the money in the world.
Yeah.
It's human to be tempted.
And can you qualify growing quickly at that time, just before you go on?
I mean, hundreds of % every year.
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean, in some ways, traditional hockey stick-ish
Yep,
growth.
yep.
Again, in those early days,
Yep, sure.
we didn't carry it as long as the companies that are now worth billions, of course. But in the early days, it was very fast growth.
Sure.
I mean, we were well in, the 40 year-over-year cutoff rate for good growth rates. For
the rule of 40.
Exactly.
You're in the triple, double territory.
We were well in that.
Sure. Okay,
and of course, that was perhaps also why there was that interest.
Yeah.
And that was why there was the temptation too. Neither Jason or I were wealthy at the time. So when a large check is waved in front of your face, even if it's not your money, that's the thing that a lot of entrepreneurs kind of fool themselves into believing, that a large investment is their money. Now, some of it does become their money, certainly in later stages, and you take money off the table, da-da-da. But the investment itself is to go into the company, right? And we were tempted by that. So I could totally see the temptation, and I could totally see the temptation as it happened to other people even at a later stage when the checks get bigger. One of the things that actually annoyed me for a hot second, because I was so proud of them being in the different category, was GitHub. So GitHub was bootstrapped, or virtually bootstrapped. I don't know if they basically or had some angel stuff getting off the ground, but they had not taken a large sum of money yet. And then I think they raised like a 400 million or something in the first round, a huge round, because they were already so far into it. And I thought, why? And then the why was somehow not as big when I realized, you know what? It's the same thing I went through, just at a different scale. At that point, those founders were probably rich by some low definition of that. But there's a difference between having maybe $10 million in your bank account or 100.
Yeah.
And I could see the appeal. And I don't necessarily even want to judge that appeal. I just want to say that it is possible to arrive at even very favorable economic outcomes by just taking a little longer. I mean, if you were to evaluate the fact that Jason and I didn't raise any money in 2007, maybe that looked a little foolish. We hadn't accumulated that much capital. But then we just kept running a very profitable software company for the next 20 years. And if you run a very profitable software company that have very high margins and you get to keep the money, you know what? It doesn't actually take that many years for you to accumulate something that would look like a phenomenal exit by normal metrics. And then you end up also still owning the company, and you end up with the freedom to design this company exactly as you see fit. And along the way, you might also realize what I've realized is that I have a bunch of friends who are much wealthier than I, and I see what that additional wealth buys after a certain point. It's very incremental at a certain stage.
Yeah.
It's very incremental what the additional things you can do with that. Now, that's not true, perhaps, again. I mean, I know it's almost, or it is a cliche at this point to use Elon for every damn example. But if your mission literally is I want to get humanity to Mars, right? Like, then there's no ceiling. Then, I mean, 100 billion is chump change. You're going to need $1 trillion to get us all the way. All the respect in the world for that kind of wild ambition. But what I find is a lot of entrepreneurs don't necessarily have that humanity-defining level of ambition. Yeah. They just have, like, hey, I'd like to be economically comfortable. And they think perhaps that these magic new levers at the top of the chain are going to unlock massive amounts of new enjoyment and massive amounts of new happiness. And I fail to see that actually happens most of the time. The difference between being poor and being moderately rich is very substantial. Yeah. And I encourage everyone to try to get moderately rich.
Yeah.
Real trouble gets moved out of your brain and somewhere else. But the difference between being moderately rich and very rich is substantially less impactful.
Do you have a rough proxy in your mind for what moderately rich means?
I'd say at this point, I don't know, $10 million? Something like that. The difference was, I used to say million, but that doesn't get you as far as it used to.
Yeah.
Today, if you have $10 million, $10 million network liquid, there's
liquid.
It's not tied up into something. Exactly, a house. There's a whole class of problems you just don't need to worry about anymore. Yep. And there's a whole sort of mundaneness of everyday life that will just evaporate.
But what's interesting is you're not jumping on the hedonic treadmill of the success of your friends. Meaning, you don't. If you didn't drive here, would you fly United?
Yes. And it's not because I haven't flown private. And I'd actually say that is a good, actually, dividing line of some levels of wealth. There's like before you have the jet and after the jet.
Yeah.
And I totally get the appeal of the jet. I've been on quite a few jets in my life, and it is truly amazing. What's funny is it's actually not even the jet itself that's amazing. It's the process before and after.
Yeah.
It is getting onto the damn jet and it taking off instantly. And you getting off the jet and your car's already there. That's pretty incredible. But outside of that, I think I've had enough of a taste of the other.
That's why every like
things.
Really rich person's thing is like take away everything, just not the jet.
And when I look at that, I go, this sounds like Aesop's sour grapes here, and I will recognize that. But I also go, there's a level of weakness in that I find unappealing. There's a level of stoic failure that I find unappealing. I cannot live without the jet.
Right.
And I try to do that with all these other trappings of material life. I really like cars. I've had the great fortune of having some of the best automobiles that money can buy. They're very nice. But I've also come to realize that the level of enjoyment you get out of literally the best car in the world, which for me is the Pagani Zonda, that is my number one car. Any amount of money, I don't care. Yeah. That's the one I'd get, right? The difference between that and like a Porsche Boxster, the last 4%, 5%, 10%, maybe, but the first 90% of enjoying open air experience, driving on some great roads, driving down, as I drove up here, driving down the Pacific Coast Highway, it's actually pretty moderate. And I can say that with some authority because I have had both.
Yeah.
And not falling in love, not falling into that trap of wealth, to me is a degree of freedom I cherish deeply. And some of it, I'm sure, is delusional. And this is what every rich person perhaps will say to some extent. That I'm not I could do without it. But I think the jet is a good example. Because I do hear a lot of people feeling, I don't know if I could do it without jet. Yeah. It is so nice. And again, okay, if that's what you really want, that's the... Great. I don't actually think it's necessarily that bad to have these goals and aspirations. I just think you are likely to end up disappointed if your sacrifices are not in line with the benefits you receive. If you think your life is going to be so much better because you get the jet, and before you just had to take business class, and you then sacrifice what? Your health, your family, your other aspirations in life to get to that point where you can get the jet. There's a lot riding on that damn jet. And if that then doesn't fulfill it, oh man, that might be a tough one. You might end up regretting that past decade you so single-mindedly put into this one thing you perhaps didn't even enjoy that much just because you were looking for that payoff. And I think that's a sad reality of some degrees of this wealth getting. And again, I'm not against wealth at all. Very much enjoy it. I would much rather be a wealthy person than be a poor person. But I also don't want to be a prisoner to it. Again, I'm not saying anything new. That is literally every book of wisdom published in the last 3,000 years.
Have you ever, did you get to the point where something happened that you realized that actually these things don't matter? Like, did you ever did you spoil yourself to the point where you're like, oh, like it almost feels like you have to touch the pan and know it's hot and it burns you before.
That's
you can hear this all day.
Exactly. And this is why this conversation doesn't actually work in a practical sense, because what every person who have not experienced that level of wealth will say, well, that's easy for you to say. That's easy for you to say. You've got yours, but I don't. And what can you say? All you can say is, well, the reason I'm telling you this is because I have direct personal experience.
What happened?
Well, I think I wrote a piece about this in 2016, the day I became a millionaire. This was the day that the check from Bezos cleared, where I literally went from having, I don't know, $20,000 in my bank account, maybe. I wasn't poor. We were already doing well with the business. I mean, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, but especially by modern standard, that doesn't sound like that much of a cushion, right? And then suddenly there were millions in there.
How long ago was this?
This was 2005, 6 maybe? 6?
Okay, yeah.
I think that's when the check cleared.
Yeah.
And I thought my life was going to be totally different. I thought, my whole sense of being was going to be totally different. And it really was for a week. For a week, that puffy pink cloud was absolutely there. And I was like, oh my God. Like, if I wanted to, I could just stop doing anything and sit in front of a TV for 3 months and, I don't know, do something, watch something. I could do whatever I wanted. And then the first realization set in, well, wait a minute. If I could do whatever I wanted, I'd do this. I'd do what I'm already doing. I'd be doing what I was doing before the check cleared. I'd be sitting in front of a computer, making things with my mind. That's a pretty good gig if you can get it, and lots of people have. And then I realized these material things are very nice. One of the first things I did was totally cliche. I bought a yellow Lamborghini. That was like, I think the check just cleared, and maybe like 3 weeks later, that fucking Lamborghini was in my garage. And it was really nice. I recommend anyone who has the opportunity to buy a Lamborghini. It is a really nice experience. And it also wears off pretty quickly. And it's still nice. I still have Lamborghinis. I love Lamborghinis. I love cars. They're very nice. Then you realize, like, after some amount of time, you're like, all right, I drive this car for, let's say, 2 hours a week. That's if you even have a lot of time for driving, right? Like, you don't actually use it that much. It doesn't change that much.
You know what's interesting? I will agree with you. I disagree with some of your points, and I really agree with this point very, very strongly. When we were coordinating this, you asked me, is there somewhere to park the car? I didn't think anything of it. I just thought he wants to park his car. I thought it was interesting that you had a car. Now I know why you have a car, because you drove up here from LA. And what I realize now is that you drove a nice car up here. And guess what? You're worried about the car. And so not only does the Lamborghini, I don't know if you drove a Lambo up.
I didn't.
But nice car.
The funny thing is, it's actually not even that nice. But, well, I should not say that. It's a very, very nice car. It's not a very, very expensive car.
Right, okay. But my point is, for the really nice expensive cars, certainly, it goes from, I bet, you tell me if I'm wrong, from, oh my God, this is incredible, to a week later, I'm numb to this, to then, it's just a source of worry. I hope I doesn't get jacked. I hope somebody doesn't scratch it. I hope that, the engine, I got to get this fixed. Has it turned in from like almost positive to neutral would feel like a good outcome.
There is some of that, but not actually in the way you describe it fully. One of the great benefits of wealth, if you spend it well, is that you can decrease your worry, and I have. I am less attached to my physical things than I used to be. And part of the reason I am is that I know if someone breaks into the car, the main thing I get is the hassle, and that's actually what I don't want. Yeah. I don't want the hassle of coming back to a broken window, right, and now I have to drive back to LA with a broken window, right, or tape on it, right, or something.
Or go to a store and get it fixed.
Or something like that. Yeah. Or now I have to get it on a flatbed and I have to fly instead of enjoying myself driving back to PCH. It's the hassle more than anything, because the money will actually fix that part of it. It's going to be expensive. That's not the problem anymore. And I think that is actually one of those key values you get out of wealth. That if you spend it well, there are plenty of wealthy people who are still very worried about a thing getting scratched because other reasons. But if you spend it well, it becomes more about the hassle. And the hassle is one of the things that anyone who do start accumulating things will tell you. There's a lot of hassle with owning stuff. I own a number of cars. They are hassle. Like, the more you have, the more hassle it is. Again, is this some argument that you shouldn't own anything? No, it's not. You should enjoy the good things in life. I would absolutely recommend that anyone who likes cars get a nice car. It is really nice. But is it worth trading away the very best things in life for? Absolutely not. And this is why in the piece I quote Coco Chanel. The best things in life are free. The second best things are very, very expensive. The second best things are very nice. But the first best things are so much better that they shouldn't even be on the same level. And I'll give just one example of this. I'm a father of 3 kids. I would trade all of it in an instant if either of those kids depended on it. And it wouldn't even be close. And I think this is one of the things, there's a whole discussion here about parenthood and what we've done in modern culture to discourage that and emphasize all the negatives and the hardship and whatever that have detracted from the fact that for most people, in most times, in most places around the world, their kids is literally the best thing in the world. It does change them in some regard as humans because they realize that suddenly the scale you thought went from like 1 to 10 in nice things actually go from 1 to 5 quadrillion. And at the top is the kids. And I think that does give you a different appreciation. And so does realizing the things that you like doing. This is one of the reasons I find the discourse online so funny. Whenever I see someone comment on the fact that a rich person continues to work. And then they have this conception, I wouldn't do that. I'd just sit on the beach. What is he still doing here? Why is he still on Twitter, for example, engaging with random strangers? He should be sitting on a beach just enjoying his life because they have this mental image of heaven that's quite fuzzy because that's how definition of heaven always is, that it's just about removing the toil they currently have in their life. And they imagine that everyone else have exactly the same toil, that they don't like their work. They don't like going to work. Do you know what? A lot of successful people, the reason why they're successful is at least in part because they do like their work. Because they do find that a satisfying experience to do. And I had the same thing. This was exactly the revelation I had once the check cleared and I had a couple million on my bank account, is that after I bought the yellow Lamborghini and a bigger TV and a few other things, I realized, oh, okay, I'm still going to go back to spending 8 hours in front of the computer because I really like programming Ruby. I really like making open source software. I enjoy expanding our products. I enjoy all these other things. Oh shit, wasn't that the same? Isn't that what I've been doing for the last 10 years, including when I was a poor student in a tiny studio apartment in Copenhagen? Oh yeah. So I guess then the vast majority of my satisfaction in life does not come from these trappings. They do actually come from the other stuff. Again, are there people with different experience? Of course there are. And this is why I think to some degree you got to put your own experience out there. And then some folks might see some reflection of it and others won't, and that's fine. But for me personally, it was a bit of a disappointment.
Yeah,
I expected more.
Yeah. I agree with you. And I had a recent experience with this where my whole life, my parents immigrated here from Iran. Real estate was one of their primary vehicles for accumulating wealth and also just like being American, is like you own a piece of land. And so always ingrained in me was like, go buy a place, go buy a place, go buy a place. I've saved money my entire life to go buy a place. And probably like 3 or 4 years ago, they were like, you have enough where you can go get something in San Francisco. It's not going to be like in anything incredible, but like you can get something. And I kept saying, I don't really want to deal with it right now. I don't want to deal with it right now. I don't want to deal with it right now. Deal with the process of finding it and da-da-da-da. And then I ended up getting a place. And again, nothing crazy, but it's been nothing but problems. It's been nothing but problems. I'm not complaining about it, but exactly what I thought was going to happen, which is I'm dealing with all these things, is exactly what happened. Yes. And it did, for a moment, if nothing else, just say, wow, like the ultimate version of the American dream that I've been getting fed since I was a kid is going and buying a place. And even that, which is literally what I thought was the dream, is becoming, like I said about the Lambo thing, it's not even just like it's exceeding or meeting expectations. It's actually like drawing me away from, it's burying me with the things that need to be dealt with. And that's not to say I'm not grateful or any of that stuff, but it was just this moment in time where I'm like, oh my God, like this one thing I can't even have that I'm supposed to have that's going to be the thing that finally makes me feel stable, right? And I always told myself, you will save all this money and then finally put it in a piece of land. Then you'll stop worrying about money, because what else are you worried about? You have your piece of land, and guess what? I'm still worried about money.
It doesn't work. And I think this is why this is such an interesting piece of information, such an interesting collection of anecdotes, because it doesn't seem to matter how many people from how varied backgrounds tell the same story of, I achieved the thing you think is a dream. Let me tell you, the dream has caveats, and the information can't penetrate. That someone who has not arrived at a point will simply refuse the information.
Yeah.
They will simply go like, whatever you say, I don't believe it. I'm still going to pursue that. And I'm torn as to whether that's actually a good thing or a bad thing. Because I actually think there is some bliss in having the ignorance about whether material things like owning a nice house or a Lamborghini is going to quote unquote fix your life. It must actually be nice to live with that level of hope that material things like a car or a house can fix your life. Because maybe it gives you some sense of going. Because if you realize the truth, which is that neither the Lambo nor the house is going to fix your life or going to actually even make it that materially different, that is a bit disappointing. Now you got to look for other things. Now you're all the way up at dealing with the problem of existence. And that's a hard problem.
But this is where, interestingly, going back to my original point around the selfish pursuit of what you're doing at your company and whether that's a good or bad thing, I'm not sure what we're describing is just a material thing. For example, maybe the person that lives in complete bliss around the ignorance of never actually attaining a nice thing and why that's blissful. You're, in my human opinion, you will reapply that to something else. For example, you're a single guy at 32 years old, and really the thing that you're quite sure will fix the problems is having a girlfriend and then a wife, right? And then kids. So you'll continue to find pockets of life that you will feel inadequate towards. And I think, interestingly, all roads lead back to you. Like, do you feel inadequate? Are you doing the things that you actually want to do? And so maybe I'm answering my own question here, but going back to, you seem to do a lot of the things that you really want to do out of a selfish pursuit of what actually fulfills you.
It's partly an acceptance of what works. When I've found something that works,
you just double down on it.
Yeah, let's do more of that. And if flow works, if that makes me happy, let me find some other activities that provide access to that. Let's do some of that.
Right. And I'm curious on the how you work thing and the modern trappings of a business today. Shopify is a company that I know you look up to a lot. Is that fair to say?
Oh, hugely.
Toby is a founder and CEO that you look up to a lot.
Enormously.
Every trap that you described, you could put Shopify into the trap, your trap. Is that fair to say? They raise venture capital. They're a huge company.
Yes.
They're in the office. All of those.
They're not in the office anymore. But other than that, yes.
Okay, maybe they were.
They were.
And they're still in. Doesn't Toby go to the office?
No.
Okay, maybe not anymore. Okay.
Well, I mean,
fine.
Just meet people in person, of course.
But definitely in the early days, they were.
They were.
For a long time.
Yes.
And maybe I'm sure you two have sat down for a beer and talked about all of these things.
Yes.
And what would his counterpoint to what the things that you're saying are?
First of all, I think what's so great about Shopify is that he beat the odds. And of course that's endearing. Does that mean that that's then a recipe I would recommend most people to take, most entrepreneurs to take? No, it's like saying, you should start playing basketball because have you seen LeBron James? You could be LeBron James. No, you couldn't. No, you couldn't. The odds say you're not going to be that. The odds also say that you have a startup, you're not going to be Shopify. That's just, the odds are not that. Is it great for the economy that people are delusional about odds in that sense? And could they also be happy with lesser outcomes? Of course they could, and of course that's true. But that's one of the reasons why I joined the board of Shopify recently. I'm not interested in just getting affirmations of everything I already believe to be true. I can get that just looking in the mirror and telling myself all the things I believe and reciting it back to myself. I want to see different ways of working. I want to also acknowledge that there are 100 different paths to building great companies, and a great society consists of different paths being followed by different people and different companies. And we can cherish a lot of those things while recognizing that the trade-offs are there. Shopify has a level of impact on the world economy that I could never even dream of I mean, what is it? 15, 20% of world e-commerce flows through Shopify. Like that's an unfathomable amount of impact on a world scale that we just don't have. I mean, the kind of products that we run at 37 Signals, whether it's Basecamp or Hey, they're serving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, not billions. And I think that's good, right? Like, I think it's actually good to have that variety. And that is part of the reason why I enjoy talking to people who've made different choices. Is, first of all, I could learn something. That happens all the time. Second of all, I can simply just appreciate that a better economy, a better industry depends on all of it. And then we show the multiple paths. And that's a part of the reason why I've been so passionate about the bootstrapping thing, because it has sounded to me for quite a while, most of my career in fact, that the tech industry was very much trapped inside an echo chamber about, quote unquote, the right way to build a business, or at least what the playbook looked like. Oh, you did your angel raise, and then you found your fit, and you did your rule of 40, and you do all these things, and you follow this established book, and then you get to 100 million, and then you do your IPO, and it takes 7 to 10 years, and okay, now it's maybe 12 or 15, but that whole package, that whole train is one way of doing it, and I think that's great. And then I also think there's a million other ways, and one of those ways is what we've done at 37 Signals with bootstrapping, and we've ended up with a wonderful company of 50 people who've had a completely outsized impact on our industry, actually, from making stuff like open source software that we just gave away for free, like Ruby on Rails, and that these things can coexist. But unless you're offered the choice, unless you're offered a menu that reveals to you the different experiences that are possible in life, you may end up picking one that doesn't suit you. For me, for example, my economic goals with creating a company was that degree of economic surety. It was not, I didn't have a mission to send humanity to Mars, so I didn't need $1 trillion. I was like, whatever the bar was, I remember when we reached that point of like, oh, I don't have to worry about groceries like ever again, and rent probably neither. Okay, pretty cool. Like that was a large part of the appeal for me about being financially successful. And then it was about focusing on the other things again. I wanted to focus on my independence above all else. That certainly is a personal, I don't know if hang up is the right word, but I can't deal with people telling me what to think or what to do. And you have to accept some degree of that, as we just talked about. If you are in a company, even if you're in a very successful company that's taking a bunch of money, so you no longer own control of that company, you're going to deal with that. Your board is going to tell you what to do. Your investors are going to tell you what to do. Okay, you got one set of trade-offs. You're probably way more financially successful, and maybe you have the jet, and that makes up for all that. Wonderful. I'm so happy for you. For me, the independence bit was one of those most important things in the world. Right up there in terms of my career with things that happen elsewhere in my life, like having a family or being a father or so forth. Like, it was something that felt so priceless that it was just not worth giving up. And some very successful people are able to have both, right? Literally, even just Toby. Toby is the CEO of Shopify. And at this point, he could do pretty much whatever he wants. And he doesn't have full ownership control, but he has built up this business. Okay, that's a phenomenal outcome. I didn't like my odds at that outcome. I wanted odds that were better than that. They're never going to be perfect. You're never going to get like 80% odds that you're going to start a business and going to be successful. But you can get better odds than whatever the odds of creating Shopify is.
What are in designing your life this way, both professionally and personally, what are the trade-offs that you have to make? Maybe what are the downsides to this structure of life and work?
Some degree of ambition / impact. And I say that, and then I already think of, like, is there anything more than I would want than the impact, for example, I've had with Ruby on Rails? But let's take that part out and say we just focused on the business outcomes that we've had. As we said, do you know what? I'm not moving the world with the products we produce. We just don't reach enough people like a Shopify does. It reaches people on a world scale. And I totally get the appeal. And sometimes I wish I had more of it, of wanting to be there wanting to be the person in the room who makes decisions about affairs on a world scale. Like I can see the appeal, and I think the world does need people who are attracted to that and are willing to bear the burden that comes with it. So I could see that being a trade-off for some people who want to make a bigger dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs would say. I'm quite content with the petite dent that I've made, but I recognize that that is a degree of trade-off. For me personally, though, it doesn't feel like there are a lot of trade-offs.
It is
because I feel like I've gotten so much of what I would desire out of it. And maybe that's a trade-off in itself. Maybe, again, that's too low of a level of ambition. That's usually the charge. I remember in the early days when we started talking about this, I remember a series of altercations with Michael Arrington of TechCrunch back in the early days, where he was incensed that we dared encourage other entrepreneurs to bootstrap because it was so unambitious. It was the path to what at the time was called the lifestyle business. That's just going to be a nice lifestyle business. Well, first of all, why are you pursuing a business if it doesn't have some connection to your lifestyle? It's bullshit either way, right? Like, we're all in this for some degree of lifestyle. Some of that lifestyle perhaps is the status of being a mover and shaker in some industry, whatever. And for other people, it's a lifestyle of some economic surety and the time to pursue other aspects of their life with full vigor. That was for me. So I never took that as an insult. I was like, yeah, that's what we're building. We're building a lifestyle business. Happens to have 50 employees, and we're reaching plenty of customers, and we're releasing open source software used by millions. Fine, whatever. That's not an insult. Is that the worst you have for me? But I do think that comes to disposition. Again, a mission or someone with a vision of sending people to Mars or reorganizing the energy usage of the world, that's going to sound boring, right? It's got, what, you make B2B software? You make fucking to-do lists for other people? Like, how is that exciting? Isn't that the great thing about the human variety? We're all driven by different levels of inspiration. I can't actually pinpoint why I care so much about B2B software. Because even to me, it does actually sound a little boring. But it just isn't. I really love sweating the details of a sign-up form. And I often think of, like, what is the root source of that? It sounds more exciting to fire rockets into space. I just don't care that much about physics. I care a lot about object-oriented programming. I care a lot about MVC frameworks. I can't necessarily explain it to you, but I am thankful that this is how it works. If literally every human in the world wanted to shoot rockets to Mars, like, could we have modern society? Could we have a functioning society? I don't think we could. We need people with different dispositions and different ambitions. And the best thing you can do in life is find yourself, is find the one that actually resonates well with who you are and what you want.
I wonder if Ruby on Rails didn't exist. Ruby on Rails is an open source software that some of the most preeminent companies run on. Airbnb, Square, Coinbase, GitHub, Shopify, and more. And it is massive. I don't even know how to define massive. How big is it?
So it all depends on how you define it. I mean, you could define it by market value. I saw one indication that half of Y Combinator's exits in terms of market cap ran on Ruby on Rails. So that's one way of defining it. Another way of defining it is that some 7,000 people have contributed code to the code base over the 20 years it's been in existence. The other way is that it's been in existence for 20 years in an industry
and
that
still
churns
used and still getting used by some of the greatest. So I guess in some ways that, I don't know, but just thinking out loud with you, like, maybe if the one trade-off that you feel potentially that you're quick to dismiss is ambition, maybe your ambition is satiated by what impact you feel like Ruby on Rails has left on the world.
So what's interesting here is I think there's a difference in terms. I am a very ambitious person, but I'm a very ambitious inward-facing person. I am very ambitious about my own skills and my own improvement. And I care substantially less about what other people do. So this is one of the points actually others have picked up on to your questions about, aren't you selfish in the development of Ruby on Rails? I'm intensely selfish. I'm making Ruby on Rails for me. The fact that there are other people who enjoy using it too, that's nice. But it's also one of those I could take it or leave it things. If no one else had wanted to use Ruby on Rails, I'll tell you, I'd still be using it 20 years later. I'd just be building it for me. And that is the ambition that I derive the greatest pleasure from. When I am able to put my own skills and abilities to work on something that is highly satisfying and impactful on my own creative outlets, that's really satisfying. It's really satisfying for me to sit down and write a piece of code where I look back and go, do you know what? I think that's a great piece of code. Other people may think it too. It may be successful. It may not be successful, but I'm really satisfied with this. And I have the same thing about writing. I write primarily for myself. I am audience member number one. I write to think. I write to record. I write to improve the art of writing. I write for all sorts of reasons. I also write because I do enjoy other people reading it, but it's further down the list. So the level of ambitions I have is mostly favored inwardly. And I do think that's a difference. I think it's almost like the extrovert-introvert level there, where some people are highly extroverted. They get a lot of energy from being around other people. And some people are highly introverted. They drain energy from being around other people. I happen to be introverted. And I also happen to be inward focused on my ambition. And that's just a different level. Now, I think it's good for the world that there are a bunch of inward ambitious people who can then share the fruits of that ambition. I've been able to share Ruby on Rails. It does bring me satisfaction, but it's not the primary one.
I find you at a very interesting intersection of contrarian and articulate. And that is very refreshing. And whether or not you agree or disagree with all of the things that you say, you have clearly thought and wrote and exhausted every thought channel into your ideas. And that's rare. And the reason you're so articulate is because you've gone all the way to the mental mat on every single one of these. And that's where your conviction comes from. And I appreciate that.
Thank you. Well, I'd also say what's funny is that I have probably changed my mind on more things in my life in the past 4 years than any other period that I've been alive. So what's interesting about the conviction and the deep dive is that even when you've done all of that work, maybe not so much in the work stuff, maybe it's more about the societal aspects of living that I've changed my mind on, but it's still possible to discover new information and then change your perception on the basis of that. I wrote a post, I think last year, about how I love to be wrong. Because whenever I'm wrong, it is a recognition that I had bad information or a bad outlook. And I was lucky enough to discover better information or a better outcome and then to incorporate that. And that is that inward ambition. If you strive to become better, smarter, wiser, you should love to be wrong. Every time you're wrong, you're fixing a bug. Every time you're wrong, you're updating your mental map of the world to be better than it was yesterday. And that to me is what's so exciting about being alive. That it's not static. That you don't arrive at this point where you are then quote unquote wise, smart, have it all figured out. Hopefully you keep accumulating better and better information. And it's almost like the scientific method in that regard, that you keep having these hypotheses about how the world works, and you keep both personally running experiments on the basis of that hypothesis, and other people are running experiments on the basis of their hypothesis. And as we discover new knowledge, new facts, new results from those experiments, you get to incorporate all of that to become smarter than you were yesterday. What I have found is that is not necessarily that universal of an appreciation. Most people don't actually love being wrong quite as much as I enjoy it, and have quite the difficult time accepting when they are wrong and incorporating a new perspective if information or facts emerge that should warrant such a change. And that seems a little tragic to me. I think that is perhaps, if anything, what have powered me through the past 20 plus years of my career, is that dedication to wanting to be less wrong. That's not even right. That's fake modesty. I think I'm right about most things, because if I did not think that, I would change my perception. If I had a current opinion that I thought like, I don't think about, then I'd try to figure out more. I'd try to get more information, more perspectives, and then I would update. So I do present with a fair amount of convictions in my current beliefs, because I think that many of them are founded in the best information that I've had available. But then you leave the door open to better information emerging.
I love that framework of fixing bugs in the pursuit of improvement. Are you what are some, maybe like just highlight reel or biggest rocks of things you've changed your mind on in the last 4 years?
DEI was enormous. Not all of it, but the underlying human sort of temperaments that underpin it, I did not have a good mental model. Before discovering Thomas Sowell and his writings on the different dispositions, on diversity and so forth, I had a different mental model. And some of it was based on just bad facts, bad statistics. And some of it was also based on a view of humanity that perhaps was flattering in a way that was delusional. And I think the great gift of the last 4 years was that so many long-run experiments came to fruition, like the results were in. For example, I used to think that illegal drugs was a bit of a weird... Why? Why do drugs have to be illegal? So you want to screw up your life? What is that of my beef? I was trapped in this idea of just a consent framework. If you do whatever you want to do, that's the highest moral value. I had to update that. And part of it was a long-run experiments with opioids that the US ran starting in the mid-90s, where opioids were essentially moved from one category of care, that is to be used rarely because they have high risk of addiction, to a different unit of care. No, they're very effective and there are minimal risks to them. I remember when I first came to the US and I had some trouble with my leg or something. And right out the gate, my doctor offered me opioids. I at the time thought, whoa, okay, I come from Denmark. Like that time, at least that was not the standard of care. So we run this long-run experiment, and it's now been running for over 20 years. And the current catastrophe is 100,000 plus Americans every year are dying from getting addicted to opioids. San Francisco is ground zero to seeing the effects of all of that. And I had to update my mental model. Oh, do you know what? This was actually a referendum on whether it would be a good idea that drugs as powerful as opioids should just be available over the counter with basically very little restraint. No, not a good idea. Not a good idea. I had to change my mind on that. And I think was one of those core things where it goes deeper than just this policy question of whether drugs should be illegal or they should be classified as this thing or the other thing. And it goes to the heart of an understanding of human nature. Like, are we better off like just letting everyone do whatever they want all the time as long as it just hurts themselves? Probably not. There probably needs to be some restraint in some regards. And then we can have a great discussion about where that restraint goes and whether pot should fall into it or not, or whatever else. But it was an example of seeing a long-run experiment come to an inescapable conclusion, an inescapable consequence, and going, I can't go on believing what I used to believe in the face of this reality. Something has to yield. I either have to shield myself from reality and come up with some cuckoo reason for why reality is happening so that I can preserve my priors, or I have to change my priors. It's probably better to change your priors. I've seen a lot of mental gymnastics being performed by people who are desperately trying to cling on to a hypothesis that was proven wrong, but they fell in love with the damn hypothesis. That's the most dangerous thing you can do as a human being. Falling in love with your ideas to the point that you're unwilling to accept reality as it presents it to you?
We have to do a part 2 at some point. You're fascinating. I appreciate you doing this. Are you driving home tonight?
I am driving to a Half Moon Bay because we have a board meeting for Shopify in the morning.
Oh, cool. And then you're driving home from Half Moon Bay?
Then I'm driving home.
Okay, good. I appreciate you doing this. Thank you for the time. I'm almost afraid to ask, like, are you hiring? I want to give you a shout out here, but...
We're not actually hiring at this moment. At least there are no open positions listed. But if people are interested, we have a mailing list for when those positions open at 37signals.com/jobs. And I have a personal website at dhh.dk where you can get more of these cuckoo ideas. I write a lot.
You do write a lot.
Especially on my Hey World. It's our own service. That's where I publish all my thoughts. And I've written some 400 essays in the past 3 years or so. So a fair amount of writing goes on there. And so if you like these thoughts, there's plenty more.
When you hear the word grit, what do you think of?
I used to think flawed model of human motivation. This was another point actually where I did and have changed my mind. There's a great author who wrote the Punishment of Rewards, who also wrote a takedown on grit, the book by
Angela Duckworth.
Exactly. And I used to find that more compelling. And then I had children myself. And I realized that perseverance and grit is absolutely a determinant in your outcomes. And you can see it from a very early age. The 3 kids I have varying levels or varying, I say, areas where they're willing to apply their grit. And I can just see the outcomes. My middle child, for example, loves Legos and have the patience and the grit to stick with it even when he gets it wrong and has to backtrack. And now he's building Lego sets for 18-year-olds as a 9-year-old. That sounds more impressive than it is. I think there've been great inflation in the Lego set markings here. And then my other kids have different areas where they have grit, and I can see the outcome of it. And if I'm honest and think back upon my career too, of course it's a marker. Of course it is. That you're willing to persevere in your pursuit of learning something and willing to take those setbacks and stick with it, even when there are no extrinsic payoffs. I think that's perhaps the most revealing things that I found as we had a long discussion about extrinsic payoffs, the wealth you might acquire if you're successful in your endeavors, the intrinsic motivation of it, the flow state as we talked about. Grit makes all of that better. Everything you can imagine to pursue is interesting if you just dig hard enough, if you just keep scratching. And I've found that time and time again, even technical domains that I thought I was not that interested in, system administration, for example, I just keep digging and I find, it actually is interesting. You just have to learn more. And that I credit developing an appreciation for grit and recognizing that it is a key component, even when it's hard. In fact, that's why it's there, right? It's there as a force to guide us when it is hard, when you don't want to do it, when you want to give up, and when you want to take the easy route, or you want to fall back on your old ideas, or you want to fall back on your own skills. I've learned a few different domains in the past 20 years, and every single time I've started as a newbie, as a beginner, as someone who sucked. And it was recognizing that state had been present before, and that I needed to apply grit to get out of it and push through it, that got me to where I wanted to go.
What an answer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me on.